Hello, welcome to the impact of research in agriculture and applied economics on the US economy. My name is Gal Hoffman, and I'm board chair of CFIR and a research economist at Rutgers University. It's CFIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge. When demonstrating the value of the profession, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agriculture and applied economics. And we're really glad that you joined us today. Next. This and other CFIR programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support and a very important support of the Agriculture and Applied Economic Association, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistics Service, NASS, and Economic Research Service, ERS. And we really thank you all. Now, it's time to introduce our distinguished panelists. Next. Dr. Robin Schumacher is the National Program Leader for Economics in the Institute of Food Production and Sustainability at NIFA. Next. Dr. Keith Coble, a Gillis Distinguished Professor, the head of the Agriculture Economic Department, and Special Assistant to the Vice President of Agriculture, Forestry, and Veterinary Medicine at Mississippi State University. Next, Dr. Madhu Khanna, the Director of Graduate Admissions and Recruiting at the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois. Next, Dr. David Zibelman, a Professor, Extension Specialist, and the Robinson Chair in the Department of Agriculture and Research Economics, University of California at Berkeley.
So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I want to just present sort of an overview of some of the concepts and perspectives on agriculture economics and its role in the U.S. economy. So I'm going to give some little background about that, talk about why social science research is important in general, and then talk about, give some brief examples of some of the kind of research that has been supported in the past by the NIFA AFRI programs. Next slide. So, why does economic research matter? It matters a lot, to begin with, but to begin to assess that, we need to know, why it matters. What's the basis for that, and more generally, why does social science research matter? Give a little bit of sort of historical perspective. In the middle of the last century, it was called the Age of Physics with the moonshot and space program, and then the latter part of the century has been called the Age of Biology with the advances in genomics and the Human Genome Project and that sort of thing. But through all of that, there's always a question of the winners and losers and understanding the impact of these events and these technological innovations and epochs in history. And so those, understanding those kind of changes really begs these social science research and economic research type of analysis. Next question. So to give, I just wanted to give you just a sense of some of the types of questions that social science addresses. The Consortium for Social Science Associations, they have a web page, and they sort of build a list of researchers that present why social science matters. And I just give just a brief set of examples here. For example, we're living in an age of infodemic, too much information, because collective behavior change is the only way we can stop the spread of COVID. It's how to understand segregation and how we can dismantle white supremacy. How do we do better than the next crisis? How do we develop an empirical basis for understanding public health problems? And I mean, you can see some of these questions, but I think the last one, because social science is a form of service that improves the quality of life for people around the world. As social scientists and economists, we take those kinds of questions quite seriously. Next slide. So why does economic social science research matter for food, agriculture, and natural resource issues? So first, before we sort of tackle that, let me just give some basic concepts that sort of characterize what economics is all about. The old, Samuelson defined economics as the allocation of scarce resources among competing wants, and that's what economics is. It's about decision making. It's about how to assess choices, the allocation of and the use of resources, the impacts of those decisions on individuals and society, the role of scarcity, and that really limits the choices. And then these decisions are driven by assessing the benefits and costs of different options. And notably, opportunity cost I think is one of the more important concepts, because what opportunity cost means is what you're giving up by choosing something. It's sort of this zero-sum sense that you can't do it all, so you can do this, but you can't do that. And so that raises the question of trade-offs. And how do we assess trade-offs? What does it mean when you're giving something up and when you're pursuing something else? And then the other things is what are those decisions? What do they have impact on people more generally? What is the role of equality and equity, and how are the two those things trade off? That's an important question that economists have dealt with for a very long time. And then what are the unintended consequences? Policy choices have often direct impacts and direct influence on certain behaviors or actions, but there's these indirect things that happen as well, and produce consequences that were not intended. And so one of the things that economists look at is they try and understand the system or the whole picture of when you make this choice, what are you giving up? What are the impacts are you having, and who's it affecting, and who are the winners and losers? So economists use these tools, these concepts to analyze issues for individuals and society. Next slide. To start to give you a little flavor for the type of research that we supported at NIFA, I want to give you a little background. So the National Institute for Food and Agriculture made its premier competitive grants program is the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, which is, I think, for this next year, I think at least I think the Senate has allocated $435 million for the overall program, which covers quite a bit of material, obviously. Within that, in the foundational program, is one of the programs is the Agriculture, Economics, and Rural Communities program, which I've been associated with for quite some time. Within that, there's this for the next couple of years, four program areas: the economic markets and trade. And then previously there'd been the environmental and natural resource economics program, but for this next couple of years, that will be subsumed under the economics, markets, and trade first. So for those of you who are interested in submitting proposals to this program and in the area of natural resource economics, you can submit that to the economics, markets, and trade program. So I wanted to get that message out there. And there's also the Rural Economics Development Program and the small and medium-sized farm programs. Both those look at the sort of the opportunities and barriers for economic opportunities for those types of individuals. And then lastly, there's a relatively new program, the Social Implications of Emerging Technologies, which takes a broader social science perspective in trying to understand what are the implications of new technologies, with big data, genomics, and the whole variety of things that have broader social implications than merely the economic consequences. Next slide. So let me just give you a quick overview of a couple of examples of the types of research under the area of sort of rural economic development. Jane Kaladinsky at University of Vermont has a project, Economic Impacts of the Hemp Industry, Opportunities for Rural Development. And here she's got a project underway where she's looking at the opportunities for resilience and sustainability in rural communities, and the role that hemp-based industries can contribute to rural communities. She's going to use a couple of economic modeling approaches to try to understand the linkages between the hemp industries and the subsequent upstream and downstream sectors as well, and so trying to learn what are the economic opportunities with this and what benefits are there for the rural communities. And then from that, she'll develop some extension-based activities to try and inform people and provide some outreach information about the role of hemp, the hemp industry. Next slide. Brian Rowe at Ohio State has a project looking at understanding food waste. He's got a project called Using Food Image App to assess the smart interventions designed to improve nutrition and reduce food waste. And this app, it actually essentially takes photographs of a plate of food that a household will have through the course of the day. And he finds that that's a better way of recording what they're actually consuming than keeping a diary. And it also shows at the end of the meal what's left on the plate and what food waste there actually is. So they can actually get a real substantial measure of what's being consumed, what nutrients are being consumed, and then what's not used and what's wasted. And one of the findings they found is when individuals have been told that the food that they don't eat will go into compost, that actually increases the amount of food that's wasted because they feel like, well, okay, it's just not going to total waste; it's going to other purposes. But that it still begs the question of, well, here's food that's not being consumed. It involved resources to produce it, and so this isn't necessarily an efficient outcome. The next slide. This project is looking at Tim Richards from Arizona State. Looked at online retailing as a means of providing marketing opportunities for farmers, and juxtapose that to the local food markets. And what he's found essentially is that it tends to be a more effective way of getting produce out to a broader audience. You can scale up more efficiently than local food markets can for certain types of products and for certain types of markets. So that's a good sign and a good opportunity for producers to consider. But local food advocates would argue that the local food markets also provide other community services and opportunities that are benefits beyond the food marketing itself. So there are these trade-offs between these two types of approaches for creating opportunity for farmers. So this is sort of an example of those kinds of trade-offs. Next slide. And this last project is from Tom Hurdle at Purdue, and it's called Economic Foundations of Long-Run Agricultural Sustainability. And Tom has been involved with developing databases and models for modeling global food production and trade. This is the GTAP project, which is the Global Trade and Agriculture Projections Project, I believe it's called. And so in this particular project or paper, he's considering the slowdown in productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. What role does technology play in mitigating some of those losses? And he considered three sources of technological change: direct R&D investment, importing technologies, and then virtual technologies, and that is sort of the technologies embodied in food or various products that would be imported. And he found through this modeling approach that between 1991 and 2011, that investments in R&D were the approximate source of productivity growth. But looking forward to 2050, trade and sort of the virtual technologies will be the important source of growth for Africa in providing food supplies. What I presented, I wanted to show you, give you a sense of the types of research that's done at very local scales, you know, the local production all the way to global scales, and this is sort of typical of the type of research that's done. Next slide. Going forward, next will be more in-depth examples provided by Keith Coble, talking about the role of contribution to crop insurance policy, Madhu Khanna talking about bioenergy, ethanol policy, and then David Zilberman talking about economics of water conservation, supply, and conservation policy. So take it away. Thank you.
I want to thank Robin for setting the stage for us. I think that's a tremendous overview, and I want to thank Robin for all the work that he's done at NEFA and in terms of thoughtfully thinking about these type of issues and what social science funding best serves these industries. My presentation today is going to be a little bit of what I would call a case study of one example that of where economists have made a difference, and this has to do with agricultural risk management, and in particular focus on crop insurance. And I know there's some people that are on this call that have been very, very involved in this as I have. So let's go to my next slide. This is a graph in various forms that I've used for a lot over the years. It goes from 1980 to 2020, and it's a jump start for a lot of conversations. But when I was a graduate student looking for a topic to work on, because I'd become fascinated with risk and it seemed so very relevant to agriculture, that I settled on crop insurance, which in the late 1980s was this relatively small program that had this dual reputation of being very actuarially unsound and having low participation. And so a lot of us, Barry Barnett, myself, Alan Kerr, Barry Goodwin, and I'm going to leave a bunch of people out, started looking at these questions of what do we do about this problem? And USDA was asking the question as well. And so over time, a very interesting phenomenon happened, is that the program, as you show this loss experience, the loss ratio representing the indemnities divided by the premium collected, has trended strongly downward over time, and you went from with an actuarial soundness at 1. And so what you've seen in the early period here is that the program was rarely under a loss ratio of 1, and then in recent years, it's most of the time it is below 1.0, and occasionally popping up above. So there's been a tremendous change, and we know the program has grown. We know subsidies were involved in getting additional participation, but I would argue that one could have taken that additional participation and not learned anything from that additional data, and that is not what happened. And I think economists had a lot to do with what happened along the way. One thing that I will say is that crop insurance is often regarded by actuaries as a little bit of a strange beast. And so our profession stepped into the breach, so to speak, and tackled this. And it seemed rather natural for us, more so than traditional actuaries. And there's no exceptions to what I'm saying, but I think we've served a great purpose along the way. Next slide, please. So this profession and the risk management agency at USDA have a long connection. Several of us as graduate students and later were participants in a research and extension committee that RMA formed in a kind of informal way, but several of my generation of ag economists got interested in these topics and found seed money for research and opportunities through this committee, and then it branched out over time. After 2000, the relationship changed in some respects because research became more contractual at RMA. But there's been a connection over the years between the Southern Regional Group, SCC 76, which now actually meets in Kansas City most years, and it's involved into part of the reason that group meets in Kansas City is because a lot of the folks that work at RMA in the actuarial units participate. Another thing that I should have put on my slide, but seeing Robin reminded me, is that NIFA has opened the door to this type of research and funding it in more recent years, which has given another opportunity for this research to be done. But it has a very strong applied risk analysis focus, and along the way, what we've seen is this very interesting combination of academic researchers sitting down with the people who work on the nuts and bolts of a government program and having really serious conversations about what are the best statistical approaches to quantifying this risk, and then also having some real compromises. In my policy class that I teach, I often tell of a story of meeting with people at the agency and suggesting a way that they could do it, and they basically said, well, the law won't allow us to do it that way. So what's your second best solution? So we scratched our heads, and our second best solution would have required a change in the database that would have cost, I think, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they said, we can't afford to do that now. What's your third best solution? And they actually implemented pretty much what we suggested that day. I still think of that as a tremendous learning experience for me about the realities of an academic researcher interfacing with trying to actually put a program on the ground. And there's been a lot of feedback along the way. Next slide. I did a quick look in Scopus over this period, and I found a lot of articles in our literature about these topics. There's been 110 articles in AJE, a lot in the Ag Finance Review. JARE has 40. The AEPP has 11 on this topic of crop insurance. And I would argue that, and I'll show some citations here in a moment, that because of these various studies that have been done, the loss ratio of that program has dropped by about 0.5. Maybe that's a little too high. Maybe it's a little too low. What it's meant is that if you think about adverse selection and moral hazard being a big part of the problem, then the program has, there's a reduction in the premium that is charged because you've got better rating. And I also want to mention that in 2020, there was $1 billion worth of area index products sold by that agency. And I think I can trace a very direct lineage to ideas that people in this profession had that led to those kind of program changes. So if you go to the next slide, please, I'll talk a little bit about some of that. You know, I know I'm going to leave somebody out that I should have included, but here are just some citations of various papers that, you know, Richard Just and Quiggin and Linda Calvin did, Bruce Babcock, Dermot Hayes, Chad Hart, a group of people that I worked with, like Barry Goodwin and my major advisor, Tom Knight, and others that I can think of. And these were studies that really had a nice component, because I think all of these had an impact on the program. And to be honest with you, part of the reason why is that the management of the agency was willing to take a look at these, and to be quite honest about it, an economist was the chief actuary of the agency. So there was effective communication between that individual, Tom Worth, for the last several years, and before that it was Jim Driscoll, that could talk to our profession, and then we could contribute along the way. Next slide, please. The index insurance examples, here's, you know, I think of Barry Barnett, and Jerry Skees, and Roy Black, and then Mario Miranda doing a lot of work in this area, and various studies that looked at index insurance. What I haven't included, because I was very specific to U.S. crop insurance programs, that in fact index insurance research has now gone into the development world, and people like Michael Carter and a lot of others people have taken this outside the United States into a development context. And so in those instances, ag economists have had a tremendous impact on the ability of individuals to manage risk. And I think that's a fundamental game changer along the way, that we can more accurately assess. And going forward, I think we're going to use big data, and we're going to use new techniques to do even more of this. Next slide. That ends my set of slides, but I think there's a lot of room for people in our profession to follow on this work, do take it the next step, and take it beyond what people like myself have done. So I'll stop there.
Good morning. I'd like to start by thanking CFAIR for organizing this event. So my talk is going to focus on some of the work that economists have been doing in looking at the economic impacts, the land use impacts, and the environmental impacts of biofuels. And my own research next slide. My own research in this area started around 15 years ago, and you know, I've been grateful for the funding that I've been able to receive from various federal sources, including NIFA and the U.S. Department of Energy. And you know, these have been key programs that have really provided research for social science led work, and you know, have been valuable for me and for many other economists that have been working in this space. Next slide. So interest in biofuels started around 2005 or so in a big way in the US, and was spurred largely by concerns about increasing or reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and imported oil. And a major policy driver that really stimulated biofuel production was the Renewable Fuel Standard in 2007, that has been responsible for more than doubling the amount of corn ethanol that is now produced in the U.S. from about 6 billion gallons or so, or, you know, in the mid 2000s, to close to 15 billion gallons currently. And as you can see, the blue graph shows that that production has really ramped up. But in addition to, while it provided this source of renewable fuel, it was accompanied by a number of concerns that it started almost immediately as production ramped up. And one of the biggest concern was really about the increase in crop prices, particularly corn price. And as you can see with the red line, corn prices more than doubled as well over just that time period of 5 to 6 years. By 2012, they were significantly higher than what they had been in the pre-RFS era. And so that led to a lot of concern about, food versus fuel, competition for land, concerns about the expansion of cropland onto non-crop grasslands and so on, and also about whether or not, corn ethanol and biofuels in general would achieve the promise of greenhouse gas savings that had also been one of the motivators for switching from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. And so this is where economists have played a really important role over the last 15 years or so in trying to really understand the role of corn ethanol in influencing these outcomes, and trying to understand, both what was sort of the direct effect of corn ethanol as well as these indirect effects that actually Robin mentioned. As one of the things that we look at is the spillover effects that might not be evident, immediately. And as we've sort of begun to understand, the story of corn ethanol and its impacts is really quite complex, because you can see from this graph itself that by 2000 and after 2012, by 2014, corn prices had come down almost to their 2007 levels, and yet corn ethanol production, has been maintained at close to 15 billion gallons. So it's really a complex relationship, and that's where a lot of the economics research has been focused in trying to understand that. Next slide. And so in addition to crop prices, around the same time, we also observed that there was a significant drop in land that had been enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program with the intent of reducing the environmental impact of agriculture. And so after 2007, there was a $12 million acre reduction in CRP acres, even though rental payments were going up. And then satellite images showed that in the bottom map, you could see the corn ethanol refineries reflected with those black dots. And satellite images showed that there was a lot of cropland expansion taking place, particularly if you look at North and South Dakota and some of the Great Plains area and Midwest. And around the same period, between 2008 and 2012. And all of that led to a lot of concern about these adverse consequences of corn ethanol production. Now, with all of this, it's important to look at, not just what happened before corn ethanol started and what happened after, but really to look at what would have happened, sort of in a counterfactual. If you didn't have corn ethanol, but other things had continued to change, what might have been the impact, and then comparing that to what happens with corn ethanol. And so that's one of the things that economists are really good at doing, is trying to do this counterfactual analysis to isolate and attribute the impacts of corn ethanol on land use change, crop prices, and so on. Next slide. And so, economists have really contributed a lot in looking at the effects of corn ethanol on crop prices, greenhouse gas intensity, land use, water quality. And in general, what this research has shown is that really only a portion of this adverse impact on crop prices that we saw between 2008 and 2012-13 could really be attributed to corn ethanol. Some of this would have happened in any case for a variety of other factors that happened at the same time. For example, increase in oil prices, increase in demand in China, and so on. We've also there's also quite a bit of consensus now in the literature that corn ethanol does reduce carbon intensity compared to gasoline. And that, again, was has been very controversial, with a number of studies suggesting that it could be worse than gasoline, but careful analysis shows that is not the case. And then another major area where economists have contributed is trying to understand this aspect of indirect land use change, which is when crop prices go up, it creates incentives for expanding cropland, not only in the US, but all around the world, and that this can lead to carbon emissions because of deforestation and conversion of grasslands to cropland. And the leakage effects of this can be much larger than the savings that we might get from displacing fossil fuels through biofuels in the US. But again, those estimates have been declining in studies that have improved over time, and with improved data and improved modeling to be significantly smaller than what they had been when this research started in 2007, 2008. But then we also show that, in fact, there are trade-offs. And while corn ethanol can reduce carbon emissions, expansion of corn, because it is nitrogen intensive, can in fact increase nitrate runoff and worsen water quality and hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. And so there is research looking at, well, how do we weigh these trade-offs? How do we compare these costs and benefits and assess what are the net benefits of having biofuels? And some of this research is now contributing to the triennial report that is being prepared for Congress as it looks into the future of biofuels and the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is currently only authorized till 2022. Next slide, please. So I just want to give you a few examples from my own research on looking at the effects of understanding the extent to which biofuels, particularly corn ethanol, led to this reduction in conservation reserve program acres, expansion in other acres, and how this was distributed spatially, and also isolating and trying to tease out the effects of the causes of these effects. How much of this was sort of the direct effect of corn ethanol refineries creating more demand for corn in their immediate vicinity and creating an incentive for farmers to switch land from other crops to corn to supply those refineries. How much was this because of this overall increase in corn and crop prices that took place that you saw in the first graph, that more broadly led to incentives for increasing land under crop production because it increased returns to land. Next slide, please. So this slide sort of shows, and the map shows, how much of the conversion of CRP that you saw on the earlier slide could be attributed to corn ethanol. And what we found is that of the land that was expiring and exited the CRP, only about 27% of that could be attributed to corn ethanol. The rest of that land would have exited CRP in any case for other reasons. And similarly, about less than a quarter of the conversion of unused idle cropland pasture that took place over this time period, we were looking at the time period 2008 to 2012, could be attributed to corn ethanol. The map here shows the areas where the share of the land that converted to crop production, and as you can see, it does map to some of the areas that you saw in the previous slides, with in the North and South Dakota areas where there was land available for conversion, and then in the Corn Belt. But really, what we found is that even though corn acreage expanded in order to meet the demand for corn ethanol, a lot of that came about by converting land from other crops. A lot of the minor crop areas under those crops declined, and the overall increase in total cropland was much smaller than was observed or attributed to corn ethanol. And so total land use change as a result of this biofuels has been fairly small. Next slide, please. And this kind of research then further tries to tease out how much of this effect that we observed was because of corn prices and how much was because of being located close to ethanol refineries. And as we noticed, and as sort of mentioned earlier, corn prices increased till about 2012 and then fell to levels as low as 2007 by 2014. And so these two maps on the top left, show that the left map shows that between 2008 and 2012 there was about a 2% increase in cropland because of corn ethanol, but by 2014, a lot of that land had reverted back into a non-crop land. And so this was a transitory phenomena that reversed after corn prices fell. The bottom two maps show the increase, about a 1% increase in cropland because of being located close to corn ethanol refineries. Next slide, please. So moving on, we're now sort of also looking at the effects of second generation biofuels, and although mandated by the Renewable Fuel Standard, we haven't yet been able to achieve those mandates. But there's a lot of research that is being funded by the federal government and other sources to continue to look at what is the potential, to continue to develop and make those biofuels a commercial reality. And our research is looking at what are the economic and the environmental impacts of those types of biofuels. And in particular, what we find is that biofuels from these high-yielding perennial grasses, and a number of those are being studied around the country. In the Midwest in particular, we're looking at miscanthus and switchgrass as the two primary high-yielding grasses. These grasses have got significant potential to provide negative carbon fuels because they can sequester a lot of carbon in the soil, and so they can save, reduce carbon emissions compared to gasoline by more than 100%. They also have advantages in terms of, being able to reduce the nitrogen runoff from cropland, reduce soil erosion, and therefore improve water quality. They can be grown on low quality land and therefore don't need to divert productive cropland from food crop production. And so there's a number of advantages from moving on towards these advanced biofuels. But in order to do that, they are more costly than fossil fuels. And in order to do that, there is need for credible biofuel policy for ensuring that a policy like the Renewable Fuel Standard is extended and implemented and is in a binding way, as well as for providing a way for landowners and producers to benefit from the ecosystem services that these types of biofuels can provide in terms of carbon mitigation, nitrate reduction, and so on. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick example of how instead of losing CRP acres to crop production, to annual crop production, and losing the environmental benefits that it can provide, here we look at what would be the benefits of actually using those acres to produce harvestable perennial bioenergy crops. And we show that this could really significantly increase farm income for the landowners with the land in CRP. It can reduce government payments with CRP. It can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and by displacing either biofuel or even better bioelectricity, fossil fuel electricity. And so a really significant win-win potential from using land for multiple purposes, not just for environmental and conservation reasons, but also to produce bioenergy. Next slide, please. So just want to end with some summary points based on this research and research in general. By economists, there is quite a bit of consensus that advanced bioenergy can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, improve water quality, increase farm income. And really what we found now, looking, with over a decade or more of research, that it is possible to meet the demand for food and biofuel by using land more efficiently. And that most importantly, that there is, evidence that agriculture has the capacity capacity to respond to higher demands. It is not a static, sector. There is responsiveness of production, technology, and in fact, with higher crop prices comes technological change and increasing productivity, and that this can be done with, at the same time, reducing the environmental impact of agriculture. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Okay, next. Okay, I'll speak about the impact of agricultural economic research on water and policy. I've been in this area for about more than 40 years, and I really like the comment of Keith and Madhu and of course Robin. And one thing that I want to mention, people, that agricultural economic research on risks started in 1975 due to different support sources from USDA, and agricultural economists established the basic principles of risk. A lot of the risk management agencies started with concepts that agricultural economists developed from the 1970s to the 1990s, and the case showed that now they guide agencies in other areas. Similarly, a lot of the research in water economics, land use, even the foundation for biofuel, started by agricultural economic research that was supported by the federal government, and it's not only helped the US, it helped the world. Next. So I started to speak a little bit about contribution of water research in terms of my area of expertise, which is water in the West, also payment for ecosystem services. So first, I'll speak about the issues of how agricultural water research really helps to deal with drought in California and elsewhere, because people that work on water are really linked. So a lot of time when I did research in California, people later on used it in Texas or Nebraska. So a lot of water in the US is allocated, especially in the West, according to water rights system, in particular, the prior appropriation system, first come, first serve, use it or lose it, and there was no incentive to conservation. So economists for years were argued for reform towards water trading that allow adoption of new technologies, sprinkler and drip, and reduce urban pressure, increase agricultural productivity, reduce the need for new water projects. So we showed it in many ways, and it was supported by USDA, EPA, the state. This 40 years of research said, gosh, we need to reform our water system. Next. Next. In 1987 to 1992, California went through a real severe drought. The allocation of water to water district declined. Farmers were asked to take their land out of production. Consumers asked to put bricks in their toilet. In the year 1999, the Department of Water Resources called several agri-economists and said, can we introduce a water market? You spoke about it. And we introduced a water bank that allowed moving water from the delta towards the Central Valley. It introduced what's called the water bank, water trading between farmers. This arrangement moved 1 billion acre-feet, more or less, and it saved about $4 billion. Actually, California survived this drought very well. The same ideas of trading moved to Colorado, to Texas, and it really developed a mechanism that allowed to deal with drought throughout the United States. Next. 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 I don't have time. Next. Can you move to okay. So the success of this program resulted in a program that's called the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. There was a lot of pressure in Congress to move a certain amount of water from agriculture to the environment. And in the beginning, the proposal was to reduce the allotment of water to water districts proportionally to their allocation. We were working with Congress and with the Senate and the House, and we suggested that instead of an arbitrary reduction of water, let's have a system of water training. So a water trading. So basically farmers will be able to sell water to will have 10% less water right, but they can but they can sell the water to other farmers or to cities, etc. Altogether, it didn't change the production of California agriculture. Actually, the last 20 years were very good for California agriculture overall. It increased the income of farmers. It allowed California to survive a future drought. And now in California, we have a system that allows you to trade water, to store water. Now there is a new law of groundwater management. And altogether, with all the problems that we have, I think California is quite resilient. We had a terrible 5-year drought, and with all the problems that we have, and of course there were problems, mostly in the urban sector, California agriculture actually prospered. Now, the knowledge of experience of our experience has been used also in Texas and Florida. Droughts are problematic. There will be more drought when we have climate change. But using economic principles, developing mechanisms like trading, developing other policies is very useful. Next. Now, drip irrigation was introduced to California in the 60s from Israel. A lot of people said, okay, let's require everyone to adopt drip or sprinkler irrigation. I was an economist, and we said, no, guys, drip can be used only in small amount of land, and it has to be improved. Instead of subsidizing farmers, let's invest in research to adapt drip, sprinkler, and other methods to different crops. So in the beginning, it was used in trees. Later on, it was used in tomatoes. Now it's used in other things. It's moved gradually, and today, there are 40% of the acreage in California are using drip, another 20% are using 20% are using sprinkler, and the areas that use traditional irrigation went down. In the Midwest, you have the same thing. People move from flood irrigation to center pivot and low value center pivot, and we work at the same idea. But the key is that the government shouldn't subsidize the transition to the technology, but the government instead help industry and farmers to develop new type of crop and new type of management system to utilize water more effectively. Next. So if you look at the water technology today, you have 40% of California is drip. There is a 1 to 3 billion benefit. We save 15% in California water. It's used in other states. Altogether, low pressure system throughout the US, I think, save something like I once estimated about $5 to $10 billion and allow increased productivity. And it's a lot of it is, in my view, is the result of research that really allow to allocate money to where the area that it needed most. Next. So another area is the economic of conservation. Now, for many years, the government would pay farmers to take land out of production. There was concern about environmental quality and how to use this program to develop, to improve environmental quality, to reduce soil erosion, wind erosion, to maintain native plants, etc. So a bunch of economists have been working for 30 years, people from ERS, John Miranowski, Kitty Smith, and others were working to come to the idea of the conservation reserve program. And the basic idea was to develop index of environmental amenities and develop payment that is based on the environmental services that are provided by agricultural program. It was very difficult to convince Congress, but slowly people realized that we can basically assess the economic value of different environmental amenities and develop programs that utilize the money in a way that would be best to the farmers and best for the environment. Next. So altogether, the CRP and other programs like EQUIP, the Western Reserve Program, the Conservation Services Program, these are programs that really shaped by economists, and they are far from perfect, but they really allow to use economic incentive and to trigger the money to increase the benefit of the money spent, and it's a win-win. The environment is better off, and farmers are better off, and agricultural production is not suffering. Next. So altogether, I think that economic research is essential for the future. It's essential to address climate change, for food security and food safety and security, to improve rural livelihood, to direct government resources very well, and to establish effective regulation. One thing that I must say that is really important, without agricultural economic research, I think that the world wouldn't be able to use a lot of the advances in biotechnology, a lot of the GMO and CRISPR, because we were the people that really showed how effective are the US policies compared to the European policies, and how we need to develop regulation that will basically enhance agricultural productivity and reduce food safety and reduce environmental risk, but at the same time enhance food safety and the value of farmers. So agricultural economic research can help to increase the value of agricultural production, result in a more effective spending of money, and result in important regulations. And it's not only useful for the US, it also provides a global framework to reach agreements and to generate a better market and better conditions globally. Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I just wanted to highlight our social media channels. CFAIR is online at cfair.org, and we encourage those who enjoyed this webinar to sign up for our newsletters, where you will get more information on similar events. There's also a Twitter CFAIR account, and all our programs are available on our YouTube channel. Just search our name on YouTube. That's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. Over the next couple of days, we're going to lightly edit this program that you saw today down and throw it up there on the YouTube channel, so you can tell your friends to check it out, and you're welcome to return and view it again. You can also email us at information@cfair.org. We want to let you know about our next program just before we wrap up, that is scheduled for noon Monday, February 1st. It's called Aquaculture in the Northeast. We've got a great lineup of speakers, and they will tell us more about aquaculture in that region. Next slide. We really want to thank a big thank to our distinguished panelists. Last but not least, we want to thank you, the audience. We're passionate about this topic, and we think you are too. But it's not a small thing to plan to give up a lunch hour to spend it with us. We want to ask you to do one more thing, and that is to follow us on Twitter. We hope you all enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed it, and enjoy the weekend that is coming.